Good evening, and we're happy to see such a big, enthusiastic crowd for two terrific people. And I know that you're going to enjoy the program tonight. Kathleen has already been put through her paces in the JFK public policy class and did a terrific job answering tough student questions. You know, they're much tougher than faculty questions are ever, or press. You know, press, they're so obsessed with the minutia of politics. Can you imagine somebody being obsessed with the minutia of politics? But we're looking forward to tonight. I know many of you have questions, and we want to continue some of the questions that didn't get asked this afternoon. But first, I want to introduce our two guests, and then we'll head into it from there. Let's see, before we get started, I hope you've had a chance to peruse the memorabilia on display during the reception. Yeah, go ahead. Let's give it a big round of applause. This is from the Christie family, Robert Christie and his wife, Deb. And stand up and say hello. They've provided all this. They have been so generous to the Center for Politics, and students for generations will enjoy what you have left. And they just had a marvelous Christmas card from Kathleen's parents in the mid-60s, I guess it was, somewhere in there, with all the kids that they had that far.
I think the mid-60s.
Was it mid?
Probably 1960 or 50. Because Carrie, my sister Carrie's a baby, and she was born in 1959.
Okay, good. Well, then you just heard it from the person who's in there. But they got all the Kennedy kids, all of her siblings,
No,
and
we just
her.
had 7. There were 4 more after that.
There were 4 more after that, yeah. No, I know that you just had 7 in there, but it's hilarious to see them all.
Because there were eventually 11. Yeah.
And they're all praying, you know, because it's a very Catholic family. I'm Catholic. I'm with you 100% on that, but it's just great to see that. Anyway, let me get back to this. This is, you know, as I said, we're upper middle age. Now, not Gilead, she's young, but Kathleen and I are upper middle age. Don't ask any more questions. But it takes a while to get this together for me anymore. But I want to thank the students that have done a great deal of work in researching each of these pieces, and we're making the collection available in our new website as a virtual museum. So we'll all look forward to that, and we thank the students. We want you to do more so we can get all this together. So get busy. Now, you're not paid. That's the way it works. This is volunteer work, and you love every minute of it. That's what I've heard anyway. Now, let me introduce our very special guest. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend is the eldest child of Robert and Ethel Kennedy, the niece of President John F. Kennedy, and the granddaughter of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. And that's a political powerhouse, if ever there was one. Quite a birthright, but beyond that, Kathleen is a lifelong advocate for women, children, and the underserved. Her career in the public arena, as well as her other personal accomplishments, are not only historic, but she continues work that is improving the lives of millions of people in this country and around the world. We decided earlier that I would not read her whole resume because then I'd have to adjourn. We'd be finished. That wouldn't be right. And Gillian, yours as well. She's had an incredible career too. In 1994, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend made history as the first woman elected to the office of Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. Before that, she served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the United States. Kathleen is the founder of Georgetown University's Center for Retirement Initiatives, and she was chair of Maryland's Task Force on Retirement Security, and is today, or she used to be, I guess you just moved jobs. She was the Secretary of Labor's representative for pensions and retirements at the Department of Labor. I do want to read that. This is very impressive. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Inter-American Dialogue, and has chaired the Institute of Human Virology, which treats over 700,000 patients.
We're actually up to 1 million.
You're up to 1 million. Who wrote this? No Christmas gift for you, okay? You got to be up to date. Over 1 million patients in Africa. She chaired the Robert Kennedy Memorial Foundation and served on the board of directors of the John F. Kennedy Library. She's an honors graduate of Harvard University, which is up in the Northeast, someplace, a small college up there, if you're not familiar. Sorry, I shouldn't have done that. She received her law degree from the University of New Mexico. She's a member of the bar in Maryland, Connecticut, Massachusetts. She's taught foreign policy at the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Maryland, has been a visiting fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. She currently teaches at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. Do you have tenure at all these places? I mean, I was just wondering.
They keep offering me to.
They should. They absolutely should. Then you can just take sabbaticals. You don't have to do anything, at regular intervals. Gillian, I'm getting to you. I'm so sorry it's taken me a while here. Gillian Sorensen has had a long career with the United Nations, including 10 years as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Special Advisor for Public Policy. She worked closely with 3 Secretaries General of the UN, with hundreds of diplomats and countless non-governmental organizations committed to peace, justice, development, human rights, refugee support, and the rights of women and girls. She was an eloquent advocate and addressed students, journalists, civic and religious leaders, and military cadets on many occasions. She's known 10 U.S. ambassadors to the UN, but not Adlai Stevenson, right?
No.
Okay, now you're too young. You're too young. But some of us here remember when Adlai Stevenson was the UN ambassador under a certain president in the early 1960s. A New York Times profile once referred to her as the diplomat's diplomat. At the start of her career, she was the New York City Commissioner for the UN and Consular Corps, leading the city's liaison office with 30,000 diplomats based in New York. A graduate of Smith College, she has twice been a fellow at Harvard. She served on the board of the International Rescue Committee and is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Gillian is active in politics, as was her late husband, that's an understatement, Ted Sorensen, who was an attorney, writer, and former counsel to President Kennedy, and I'm very grateful to him for so much assistance in my own book, The Kennedy Half Century. He gave me lots of inside information. He had a wonderful way of communicating with me. He didn't want to be quoted on certain things. So I'd ask him, and then he wanted me to boil it down to a yes or no, and then he would either go, or, and it was, even if I'd been filming him, it would have been impossible to tell, but I was sitting right in front of him, so I knew whether it was a yes or a no. But it was great. Got some good information that way. Okay, we're going to go to student and audience questions very quickly, because while I have a long list of them, they're not nearly as interesting as what you're going to ask. Of that, I'm absolutely certain. Kathleen, I think first you told this to our class, but there are other people here, and you've got a very special duty. You're heading to, I think, San Diego from here, or later this week, and you want to tell us about that very special duty that you're very proud to carry out.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, the Navy, under Secretary Mabus, who was the Secretary of the Navy under President Obama, has named a ship, the RFK, after my father. So I'm going to christen the ship on Saturday morning, which is very, very exciting. And I have to say, Secretary Mabus created, this is a refueling ship, and he named the whole fleet of refueling ships after John Lewis, and they're all going to be civil rights leaders named after civil rights. And the idea, I think, is that to refuel America, we need civil rights leaders because they give us the fuel to be the America we should be. And so this one is named after my father, and I'm very excited to be able to do that. If you don't know much about refueling ships, for instance, an aircraft carrier needs to be refueled every 4 days. That means it needs to have somebody actually bring the fuel, bring the medicines, and bring the food that the 5,000 sailors on an aircraft carrier need to eat. So they're very important. They actually make the Navy work. If they didn't have the fuel, nothing could go forward. So I'm very excited to christen the ship. It's made by General Dynamics in San Diego.
That is wonderful. And by the way, you should practice, because I've been told by one person who christened a ship that she had to hit it 3 times and it still didn't break, and she had to bring somebody else in to help her break the bottle of champagne over the ship. It's amazing.
That's such a sweet thing to say.
No, I'm just telling you, I'm trying to help.
It helps, it fills me with such confidence. I wish I were in one of your classes.
Yeah. This is what I do. I've caused problems for so many political people, you wouldn't believe it, over the years. It's been a lot of fun. Okay, all right, Kathleen first, and then I'm going to go to Gillian. You have so many special memories, so many stories about your father, and really you were around for the administration of your uncle, where your father was the advisor. They worked together as a team throughout. Any special story or two that you can share with us? Make it as interesting as you want and as unknown as you'd like.
Well, I think, so you can learn about, I think I don't know how much you teach in your class about my father and John Kennedy. I'm going to tell you mostly a story about, you're going to talk about John Kennedy, I think, probably. And you want to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I'll talk about JFK. I don't know. We'll see how.
Well, I'm just asking, because you know so much about foreign policy, I thought maybe you could talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think is a very interesting story. So I'm going to talk more about civil rights and poverty, because that's a personal story to me. So my father, as you know, no, first I'm going to talk about organized crime, because I don't think a lot of you understand about organized crime. That's what I understood from that class.
Okay. Don't mention Italians, though. I'm just telling you.
What would they have to do with organized crime?
Thank you very much. That was the right answer. Thank you.
I won't tell you about my visit to Sicily then. Okay, so when I was 4 and 5 years old, most young kids, when they're 4 and 5 years old, their parents take them to the playground, right? My mother took me to something called the Senate Racket Committee hearings. And that's because my father was then investigating organized crime. And so some of my first words were, I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that it may tend to incriminate me.
Yes, and President Trump is very familiar with that answer, too.
So literally, I heard those people say over and over again those words. And just so you know, and I said this to the class, at that time, my father and J. Edgar Hoover, who was then the head of the FBI, really had an argument about whether there was such a thing as organized crime, because J. Edgar Hoover didn't want to acknowledge there was organized crime, because that would mean he'd have to investigate it, and he didn't want to investigate it because he was afraid that if he did investigate it, his agents would be turned. That is, they would be, bribed, and which was probably what happened, because organized crime was very popular. Very powerful, not popular, also popular. And the only reason J. Edgar Hoover and Daddy wanted a statute get passed, which eventually became the RICO statute, which is actually one of the statutes that is now being used in Georgia. Was eventually passed at the federal level. Anyway, the reason that J. Edgar Hoover agreed that there was such a thing is Daddy got somebody, I won't mention his ethnic background.
Thank you.
To go to the Poconos and wear a wire and listen to 25 people talk about all the crimes they were going to commit. And when that wire got shown to J. Edgar Hoover and to others, he admitted there was such a thing as organized crime and agreed to get the RICO statute passed. So I'm just telling you, that's the history of it. Why it affected me, obviously, is because I listened to those hearings a lot. And number one, that's not what usually 4-year and 5-year-olds listen to. And second, when I was in 3rd grade, the mob was still so mad at my father that they threatened to throw acid in my eyes, and the acid in the eyes of my 2 siblings, who were then attending Our Lady of Victory School, which is a parochial school in Washington, D.C. 45 kids in one class and 1 nun. It was a lot, which you could do at that time because you had the promise of heaven and the threat of hell to keep you in line. So I used to go out after school and play with my friends, and we'd go play. And so for about a 4-month period, I was not ever allowed to leave the school until my mother came or somebody came to pick us up. We always had to go to the principal's office to see if there was a car there to pick us up. And we weren't allowed to leave our property in Virginia. We were in Virginia at that time. So I learned early on that if you're going to prosecute bad guys, the bad guys will try to get back at you. And so I thought that's a story that you may not have heard. And it was really a story about the threat of going after organized crime, and it's still a threat in our country. Now I would say it's mostly drug cartels coming from South America, and not Italians from Sicily.
Yeah, absolutely. They had nothing to do with anything. You may not know this.
Yeah.
I know our group that's going through the JFK documents that are being gradually released
Right.
between now and 200 years from now. One of them is it's a frightening piece about when your father was Attorney General, and he was followed by someone connected to the group that I don't admit even exists.
Yeah.
Starts with an M. And the whole purpose was to try and do bodily harm, shall we
Yes.
say, to your father. And this was apparently never followed up on, or they never caught the individual. But it was a tough
Just to
time.
remind you, as you know, the mafia was largely created by the United States government during World War II. So, in your defense.
Thank you. Yes, and remember, we did our part in Cuba too to recover the hotels and casinos. You know, after Castro seized them all. You all know this. Those of you who are older.
Actually, one of my best friends was had
No,
a
go ahead.
partnership with them. Okay, we won't get into that. I could also tell you, I think it's your turn to talk.
No, go ahead.
No, it was good though. I was very interested in that. We'll talk more about the mafia later. Gillian, you had the opportunity, obviously, to talk to Ted in great detail, I'm sure, about his experiences then, although he went on to do other wonderful things as well. Do you have a favorite story or two of his relationship with President Kennedy and, at that time, Attorney General Kennedy? I think President Kennedy referred to your late husband as his intellectual blood bank. And so much of what Kennedy wrote, and he always worked on it as well, but so much of the words that we remember from John F. Kennedy came in part from Ted Sorensen, his speechwriter.
Well, thank you. And first, I have to say what a pleasure it is to be on stage with these two very special people and to be here at University of Virginia on the most perfect day of the year. If you allow me, I just want to frame this a little bit.
Certainly.
And to make clear that I was not present in those days during the Kennedy administration. Ted and I met and married quite some years after that, but then we were together for a long, long time. So I heard him talk about it and write about it and occasionally discuss it, and to the point that I almost feel as though I was there. And as you say, Ted became known as the speechwriter and then in the White House special counsel to the president. But I am intrigued by one story, and that is, how did they come together? Ted grew up not in Massachusetts, but in Nebraska, in Lincoln, Nebraska. He went to public schools. He went to the University of Nebraska and the law school there. He graduated at the top of his class. But it's Nebraska, after all. It's midway across the country. But he had in the back of his mind that he really wanted to work in Washington, in government somehow. But he didn't know a soul. 3 weeks after graduating from law school, he set off for Washington by train with one letter from one professor to one lawyer in Washington who was kind enough to meet with him. So he went off to Washington with this one letter in hand, and that lawyer was kind enough to meet him. It was summertime. That lawyer didn't have any opening in his law firm, but he helped him get a temporary assignment. And then the elections came along, and various new people were elected. And the senator for whom he was doing a temporary job, Senator Douglas, sent him over to the office of the newly elected senator from Massachusetts.
Can we just say Senator Douglas was from Illinois and was
Yes.
really one of the premier senators in American history. You may not have heard of him, but he was really one of the great people. So just so you know that
Yeah.
if you have a warm place in your heart for somebody, Senator Douglas would be one of the people you'd have a warm place in your heart for.
So so Ted did get an interview with the newly elected Senator Kennedy. And they were taking furniture into the office. They were barely open and functioning. And they sat in two straight back chairs outside the office for a rather short interview, maybe 10, 12 minutes. Apparently the senator read the letter and looked at the bio. And he looked at Ted and he said, well, you're not from Massachusetts. You're not Catholic. You're not Irish. And you didn't go to Harvard, but this looks interesting. Long pause. Let's give it a trial run. So they gave it a trial run. Ted started working for the new senator about 3 days later, and he worked with him until the end. And over time, in the beginning, he was a legislative aide, but little by little, speech writing came his way, and he seemed to have a knack for it. And he and the senator seemed to connect, despite their very different backgrounds and social status and all of that. They connected through their love of history, of politics, of course, of poetry, of humor, good stories, funny jokes, and their sense that words matter, not just what you say, but how you say it. And that words had the power not only to inform, but to inspire and to bring people together. And that connection with speeches brought them closer over time. And then, of course, they traveled together for years. And in those days, the senator wouldn't travel with a team the way they do now. It was basically Senator Kennedy and Ted across the country, here, there, and everywhere. And Ted would sit out there for every speech. He'd make notes, what worked, what could be said maybe a little differently, a little better, something about the voice or the pacing or the modulation. I remember asking Ted, well, did the senator object to criticism? Ted said no, he welcomed it. He welcomed it and he heard it, and we worked, and apparently over the next year or two, the senator's speaking and his delivery and his impact seemed to improve quite a lot from doing it, but also having a loyal coach to help. So that's how they got started in that long partnership, and it meant the world to Ted.
Well, it made a giant impact, because those, sometimes they're video segments, sometimes they're excerpts of speeches that were delivered but not recorded, and they continue to have an impact. I mean, I see that in the classroom with some of these students. They're moved by those words, how they were delivered, how they were written, and it does matter a great deal, not only what you say, but how you say it.
Can I make
right ahead.
a point about that? How you say it. Obviously, the words are great, but both my father and I remember my father standing in front of the mirror and practicing over and over again his speeches. But both President Kennedy and my father took classes in the Stanislavski method, which is an acting method, which I think Marlon Brando used too, to become better speakers. And so just so you know, when you think that John Kennedy was a naturally good speaker, he wasn't. It took work. And that's also true of my father, who, my Aunt Eunice, there's a story about how Eunice said that Jack Kennedy and Teddy Kennedy would be natural politicians. My father would never be a politician if he hadn't married my mother. And she gives, and the example is, Daddy gave a speech, and Eunice said, "Oh, you were terrible." And Mommy said, "Oh, Bobby, you were just great. Everybody loved you. Oh, you're so terrific." So the point is, if you're a spouse of a politician, your job probably is to say you're wonderful. Just so you know, maybe none of you want to be a spouse of a politician, which is fair enough. But that's what my mother's very good role was. Other roles as well. But the point of my story is, Ted was a great speechwriter, but it really does take practice. You may not want to go to an acting school, but a lot of people who are politicians, I did go to an acting coach. I didn't become as good a speaker as any Jack or Bobby, or my father, but it helps. And so I just want you to know, practice, practice, practice is what they did. And people just think it came naturally, and it didn't.
No, I've seen a lot of the early speeches, and there was tremendous improvement. And you only get that kind of improvement by working at it, and by doing it and seeing which lines work with a crowd and which ones don't. You did worry me a little bit when you brought up Marlon Brando. I thought you were getting into The Godfather. I'm grateful you didn't do that.
I found a soft spot in you.
Yes, I'm very sensitive about it.
I can see that.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll talk about that
I can
later.
tell you stories. The things I was called by Irish priests when I was in Catholic school, but I don't want to get back into that. It's a long time ago. Let me pick up a question from the audience that doesn't have anything to do with the mafia. Is any question separate from the mafia? Who was in line to give? Matthew, go ahead. Oh, you have to pull it up. See, they have to. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kylie. I'm a second-year student here. My question for you, Ms. Kennedy-Townsend, is what is something, maybe we know a lot about you and your family, what is something unexpected that you could tell us that would surprise us a little bit?
I don't know if this is the right time to tell the story.
Sure it is. Sure.
Okay. The question was, what is something that we don't know about you? And, okay, well, so when I was in college, I had a crush on my teacher.
That's never happened to me, so I don't know.
We had different teachers.
I'm sure.
So I said to him, I think we should see each other more often. And he said, why? I thought, oh, you're so dense. And then I learned that he had a girlfriend. I thought, double whammy. So I had this problem. I had this guy that clearly wasn't going to see me during class, and he had a girlfriend. So how was I going to get him away from his class and from his girlfriend?
Well, how did you do it?
I majored in American history and literature, and we were reading Mark Twain, Life on the Mississippi. So I suggested that we build a raft and float down the Mississippi. So we started in Cape Girardeau and floated 500 miles down the Mississippi River, and that's the raft. And it worked. He married me. And we got 4 children. Now,
Is that unique?
that's the raft, yeah. And I can tell you about the Mississippi if you want to know anything more about the Mississippi, but I mostly found out about my teacher.
very unexpected.
And why did, you can ask me, but you haven't, two things.
Go ahead.
Why did we get off the raft in East Carroll Parish, Louisiana? Because it was 1972, and I had to get to the 1972 Democratic Convention in Miami that year.
They needed you.
They did.
Yeah.
I was for George McGovern.
Yes.
And just to tell you, he didn't get on until 3 o'clock in the morning, which was not a good way to start off his campaign. And the second thing, when I've told that story to a couple of new girlfriends that I've made, they said, Kathleen, did you ever think of just shortening your skirt? That's the end of my story.
Look, back to the mafia. That was a great story. We'll all remember that. I don't think there's any question about it. Jillian, can you match that?
You're not supposed to be competitive like that.
I can tell by her response she's not interested in matching that. Anyway, let's get back to the stories about your father and your uncle and your late husband. It seems to me that rarely in American history did you have the kind of synergy that occurred between really those three people, because your father also enjoyed working with Ted Sorensen and found him to be a good sounding board for anything that they were working on in the Oval Office. Were there ever disputes that were serious enough so that you could tell there was tension there?
From what I heard during the White House years, occasionally there was a little tension between Ted and Bobby. But after the assassination, and especially when Bobby was deciding to run for Senate in New York, they grew closer together. And Bobby, I don't know if you knew this, Bobby urged Ted to come up to New York. Ted was looking for a job and had to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. He did end up going to New York and did get very involved immediately in Bobby's Senate campaign and then in the presidential campaign. And I think in those later years, they were close and they were in touch on a quite regular basis, and had a measure of respect and friendship that was very special.
Do you know? Can you give us an example of the tension that exists? Yeah, go
I
ahead.
can give an example of the tension.
Go ahead.
So there was a tension about the civil rights and whether whether John Kennedy, this is in 1963, and there was a tension about whether John Kennedy should say that civil rights is a moral issue. And nobody in the White House thought he should say that, because if you looked at the political map, the South was Democratic, and the South had given John Kennedy a lot of votes. And the more that he made civil rights said it was a moral issue, he was going to lose the South. And my father, as the Attorney General, came into office, and he had to start implementing a number of court judgments, for instance, integrating the University of Mississippi, which was, as you know, 2 people died, 200 people were injured. He had to call in the troops. He'd seen how difficult it was to get anything implemented. The FBI, not only didn't they like to go after the mob, they certainly didn't like to go after people in the South who were pro-civil rights. I mean, there was a lot of fighting in the Justice Department between my father and J. Edgar Hoover, to put it mildly. And my father got more and more frustrated with how difficult it was to get the people's civil rights represented. And so he wanted John Kennedy and Martin Luther King John Kennedy to give a speech because they were going to introduce civil rights legislation. And he thought it was important that the president say something. And a lot of the people in the White House were afraid that if he said something too strongly, it would hurt his reelection chances. And finally, my father got him to agree to that. And he was supposed to give a speech that very evening on national television. And they were writing the speech like at 15 minutes, 5 minutes before he gave it. It wasn't fully written as he was giving the speech in front of TV. And that would be a tension between Ted Sorensen, who was helping to write the speech, but it wasn't fully written as he was about to give the speech. So
I think Ted's reservation on that had to do with timing. He supported the civil rights effort completely, but he also was worried about the impact on the election. And if I remember correctly, he suggested that he could just put it forward a year, get over the 1964 election, and then go after it full steam.
That's true, but that was the point. I mean, timing is, and as you know, if you had read Letter from a Birmingham Jail, he said, enough, patience, we want to do it now.
Yeah.
Look, this is one of the challenges. So I'm just giving you, that was one of the disagreements. And just to think about, I just wanted to, one of the things that I think is incredible about that time, within 3 weeks, President Kennedy, John Kennedy, gave 3 amazing speeches. He gave the speech about civil rights being a moral issue. He then went to Germany and said, Ich bin ein Berliner, which is, maybe it's hard for each of you to understand how incredible that is, but it was 20 years after the end of World War II, when people were still so angry at the Germans. His own brother had been killed by the Germans. I actually took my junior year abroad in Italy, and then I stayed with a family. And one night, the family said, when your uncle said, Ich bin ein Berliner, we were so mad, because how could he say he's German? Did you know what the Germans did to us in Italy? That was just terrible. And I had never understood how tough it must have been on everybody in Europe when John Kennedy could say that. And yet he did. And then he went to Ireland and gave another speech in which he said, he went to the place where he grew up, where his great-grandfather had grown up, New Ross. And there's a factory there. And he said, you know, it's just a matter of luck that I'm not working in the factory and you're not president. Just because my great-grandfather left. It could have been your great-grandfather. And I thought that was, in a sense, such a beautiful thing to say, because there's this belief sometimes in America, I'm here because I'm better than you. I worked harder. I'm smarter. Yeah. And instead, he was saying, you know, some of us just got lucky and our grandfather left and yours didn't. Yeah. And I'm not better than you or smarter than you or worked harder than you. It's just things happen differently. Yeah. And those 3 speeches, I think, are a beautiful, incredible moment in what, as you would say, speechifying does. They say something beautiful and true about the human condition.
I'm so interested that you refer to those speeches. I had actually made a couple of notes just thinking about this and had recalled, and this connects with what you've just said, Ted thought the 3 most important speeches were the one at American University.
Yes, I should have mentioned that
right.
too. I thought if I mention one more, they're going to go to sleep.
And the inaugural, of course, and the speech in Berlin.
Yeah.
But then he did add that his favorite was the speech in Ireland. And that, of course, had a warmth and a spirit around it because that was his own heritage.
Right.
And the American University speech I think has lasted as long as the others.
Can you tell them a bit about that
Sure.
speech?
This was a graduation speech at American University, and I guess it was June of 1963. And I'm sure you've seen excerpts from it because Kennedy had been working hard to reach out to the Russians, and of course we had the test ban treaty coming up in July, I believe it was, and there were other indications that Khrushchev had recognized, along with President Kennedy and Attorney General Kennedy, that because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were closer to Armageddon than we really had ever thought. And because of that, they wanted to take concrete steps to do something about it. And so I thought the way Kennedy did it, and I believe Ted was involved in writing that speech, if I'm not mistaken, he took a very personal approach in comparing the way Americans think and the way Russians would probably think. You know, we all worry about our children, or we all consider our children's future. We are all mortal, which was the conclusion of one sentence there. And it was a beautiful speech. It wasn't delivered with any particular verve. It wasn't a speech that you would give in a football stadium, but it was a very powerful speech. And you really ought to look at these. They're all on YouTube. All of the ones that were just mentioned are, they're out of time, but they fit so well. And you really should see them if you haven't already. I know the students have. They've seen part of it in class, and they're so good at that. They've watched everything else after class because they love doing extra work. I believe that's what you've told me. Anyway, go ahead.
Who was the guy that started Earth Day? The senator?
Oh, yes, from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
The senator from Wisconsin who started Earth Day. This is a quiz. Nelson, Gaylord Nelson.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so
You get the
I'm going
prize.
to tell you how the American University speech came to be.
Okay.
So Gaylord Nelson, who was a senator from Wisconsin, went to my father and said, I care a lot about the environment, and I think President Kennedy should go on a 10-day environmental tour across the United States. Nobody's ever heard of this tour, right? You've never heard of this tour.
No.
My father loved the environment. He used to, every Sunday, we would take hikes through the woods. In the summers, we go down the Mississippi, not the Mississippi, the Colorado River, the Snake River, the Yampa and the Green. And I mean, we did a lot of environmental stuff, go hiking the woods and hiking with Justice Douglas. And so he thought that was a great idea. And so he went to his brother, the president, and said, why don't you go on an environmental tour across the United States and bring up the issue of the environment? And in fact, President Kennedy had put a large part of Cape Cod into an environmental wilderness. So President Kennedy thought, great, I'll do that. So he started his environmental tour and started talking about the environment. Nobody paid any attention to him. That's why you've never heard about it.
You know,
So he realized, this is not going very well. So he switched about halfway through and started talking about arms control, in which people did pay attention. So two things came out of that. One, he realized people cared a lot about arms control and nuclear arms control. So he switched from talking about the environment to talking about nuclear arms control. And Gaylord Nelson realized, oh, there's no audience for the environment. I better create an audience. And that's why he started to work for 12 years to create Earth Day.
I didn't know that.
I know you didn't, so I thought I'd tell you.
You were the professor. I'm the student. Thank you.
And so, I think I'm telling you that story because it's such a great story about how people think that leaders can really lead. And in fact, it was the people who said, do arms control. And it wasn't until Gaylord Nelson spent 12 years trying to get people interested in the environment that there became an environmental movement. The president, even though he did care about the environment, couldn't do it on his own.
It could have been a second term focus, though. Silent Spring had been published, and I believe
But
they
it
read
wasn't
it.
enough people. I'm just telling you the story.
Sure.
Anyway, I thought
Well, I'm just disputing it.
No, but along with the civil rights effort. along with the civil rights effort, to have the environmental effort, or climate change. We didn't even have the term climate change back then, but to have those two as key efforts in the second term would have been very logical, wouldn't it?
Well, the civil rights, there was marching in the streets with civil rights. There was leadership. There were people going to prison. I mean, there was a huge movement, which is why you could have the Civil Rights Bill, the 1964 bill, and this. Although I think that came largely because President Kennedy died. I don't know if that would have worked really had that not happened. I think that's a good question in the Voting Rights Act. And President Johnson's determination to get that through. I think that was very, very important.
I'm amazed at what you all said about the civil rights speech, though, because it is absolutely one of the most powerful, moving speeches, in which he quoted portions of the Bible.
Yeah.
We don't want to get back into the Catholic versus Protestant thing again on the Bible, which we talked about in class. But it's something you absolutely should see if you have not seen that. To think that portions of that were written right up to deadline because it flowed so well and it was so moving. It's I find it remarkable, and I had never heard that before.
Yeah. Well, if you see some of those speech texts, you'll see that they're typed in the old-fashioned way, but you'll see the markers and the lines and bring this down here and cross this out, and you can see that it's being redone right up to the last minute.
But I think that kind of speech can work if you're saying it's a moral issue, because there have been so many discussions about what civil rights was about, what it meant, and why it was important for 2.5 years. And so it comes out of your heart. A lot of speeches don't have that human heart part, but civil rights did, and that's probably why it flowed, even though it was written at the last moment.
Yes.
You could say the same thing about my father's speech in Indianapolis after Martin Luther King died. That was also written on the cuff. And why was it so good? Because it comes
Did he write that himself? Did he?
Yes.
Was that spontaneous?
Yes.
It was brilliant.
This is the one where on the night Martin Luther King was assassinated, Robert F. Kennedy was appearing in Indiana anyway, in Indianapolis, because it was during the presidential primary season. And he made a very simple, but again, very moving statement about how he had lost a relative. He had lost his brother, and he was killed by a white man. And he encouraged both sides to reach out and find some brotherhood in the horrible thing that had just happened. I mean, really, it's just incredibly moving. You should see these things if you haven't. Today, everything's so artificial.
Anyway.
Everything's so artificial.
And when he did that, about 100 cities broke out in flames that night, and not Indianapolis. Yes. And it was all attributed. In fact, the police chief of Indianapolis, not to mention the mayor, who was then Mayor Lugar, then became senator, they wouldn't accompany him into the inner city. They were too afraid. Daddy went with no protection.
Really? There was no protection?
No, because the police chief said, it's too scary to go there.
Wow.
Profiling courage.
Yes.
To coin a phrase. Okay.
Could I take us to a different situation?
Yes.
The Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes, that's what I thought you should do.
Yeah. I'm sure you all know about the original crisis. Early in his career, not the Bay of Pigs. So people tend to confuse those sometimes, very different. But the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviets were bringing missiles, setting up missiles on the island of Cuba, and also on submarines. I had the most unusual experience, and on this case, I was present. Ted was invited to what I can only call a reunion of the participants in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cubans, Russians, and Americans. And it was when Fidel Castro was still well. It might have been, I think the year might have been 2002. And of course, not everyone was still alive, but there were quite a number, including a couple of admirals and Navy people from the Soviet Union who came all that way. Fidel presided with his usual presence, and he was very striking and tall, and I was just an observer. But it was, first of all, fascinating to see this group, Russians, Cubans, and Americans, gathered around a table in Havana. Were you there?
No.
No. And Fidel was presiding, he opened, and in effect was inviting everyone to tell not just what they knew about the event, but even more what they didn't know. This is, of course, before the internet and before cell phones. So you had the Russian submarines there, underwater. You had people setting up the missiles on the island, and the breaks in communications were very real. In any case, the opening morning went along. Fidel had introduced and then sat down and was quiet for a couple of hours until a Russian said something that made him literally jump out of his seat. And that was that the Russian had said that those subs actually had missile tips on the head of each submarine, and all it took for them to fire was for the captain of that sub and the deputy, if that's the wrong term, the number 2 person, to say, yes, go. And that there were at least 2 submarines who had that situation where the captain was ready to shoot, to fire, and the number 2 said, no, sir, don't. If those missiles had gone off, we could have had World War III right there. And what caused Fidel to leap out of his seat was that he said, you didn't tell me. You would have blown Cuba out of this universe. You would have destroyed our island. And he went on for a full hour in anger and distress, but especially anger at the Soviets. And he clearly didn't know that before this reunion. And that led to a sort of tension through the whole room. Everything ratcheted up like that. And there was, for the next full day and a half, very tense discussion. But I have to add, it was a bit relieved at the evening because they had very delicious dinner. And you might know that Cuba produces some of the most remarkable dancers on this earth. And they had a dance performance. I love dance. It just took my breath away. And to have that sort of eased the tension a bit. And I will say the next day's conversation was more, if I can say, collegial, at least more open, and the tension had subsided. But that was a fascinating encounter. I don't know of any other situation coming that close to war where they would have a reunion to discuss it all those decades later.
And that's where President Kennedy deserves enormous credit. In fact, your late husband said to me, we've discussed loads and loads of subjects, but you need to understand, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for the cool head of President Kennedy, Attorney General Kennedy, and the other advisors around that table, because there were military people there who absolutely wanted to go with the first strike. Knock out Cuba, knock out most of the missiles in the Soviet Union. And what they found out later, both sides, they didn't know some of the key ingredients on either side. They didn't realize that the submarine commanders couldn't be in touch with the Kremlin. They had the authority to fire missiles on their own. They couldn't reach it.
Where were they going to shoot the missiles? Where were the Cuban
Probably
submarines?
to Florida, or maybe up as far as Washington.
Oh, and then so Castro was worried that if they did that, the reaction would be against Cuba, not against the Soviets.
Yeah.
Probably be both. Probably would have been both. But
And if I can add one other point, and then I'll stop on this. It's my understanding that they had received 2 letters. You must know
Yes,
about this.
right.
2 letters from Khrushchev. One was very belligerent and very much in the language of what they considered the Department of Defense of Soviet Union. The other was more personal, a bit more conciliatory, and Ted and your father reviewed those and said to the president, I think, or maybe it was the reverse, maybe the president said to them, ignore the more belligerent letter.
Which came last, which came second.
Oh, okay.
The nice letter came first.
Yeah.
The more belligerent letter came second.
Okay. And Ted and Bobby then drafted the letter in more personal terms and in a more conciliatory response that helped tone down the dispute.
Yeah.
Am I?
Yeah, that's
do you
correct.
understand that?
Yes. But I think that I've read some of the things that my father said about the people around the table at the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he said people were not, they kept changing their mind. People were so unsteady. That's what he found. And when I read them, I'm a person who's in charge of letting people see the letters, my father's papers. Mm-hmm. And I've released everything except very personal things, like bills from my mother's inappropriate things. So they should.
We get it.
Yeah. But I wouldn't release this because it was so awful. And I thought, not till their grandchildren have died will I release them. Because it was, why hurt somebody's character at this point? And, when some people do terrible things in moments of crisis, there's no reason to beat up on them. Mm. But I think the Cuban Missile Crisis did not bring out the best in people. That's what I would say. Mm. And I think that's a good lesson for all of us. When somebody does something creepy to you, it's probably not the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it might be a crisis for them. So let it go for a little bit, because Daddy had to let a lot of what people did go, because they were all the heads of huge organizations that worked in the military, and you couldn't have held everybody responsible for what they did during that really crisis times.
But they did get, not revenge, but they had a lesson, an educational lesson for the public when President Kennedy, and I believe your father was involved in the decision to let the filmmakers for 7 days in May use spaces in the White House during a time when the Kennedys weren't there. If you haven't seen 7 Days in May, you'd better see it, because it has new relevance after what happened on January 6th. We always believe, it can't happen here. We won't have a coup. Can't happen here. Well, we nearly had one that might well have succeeded very recently. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a real fear that under certain circumstances, some very belligerent members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, one later became the vice presidential candidate under George Wallace. That should tell you something. They wanted the American public to realize it was a possibility. This is a very tense movie. You should see it if you haven't.
And have you studied General LeMay?
Well, we've mentioned him in class. That's all I can tell you. Yeah, Curtis LeMay was the one I was referring to, who ran with George Wallace. Crazy. I mean, it just nuts.
He wanted a war.
He wanted a war.
He wanted a war.
We would win the nuclear war, he said. We've got to do this. This is the natural conclusion to World War II. I mean, it's scary that people like that can get to the very top where they actually have the power, potentially, to do some of these things. Look, this has been wonderful, and I've learned from both of you tremendously, but I do want to call on a few of the students, because I promised to, for one thing, and second, they really do have better questions. Matthew Foley has had one he's been dying to ask since class, okay?
So, first of all, your father, Robert Kennedy, is a great personal hero to me, but your mother is a hero in her own right for her ability to raise a large family and champion so many important causes. So what did you learn from her about courage and about balancing like a lot of different things at one time? And
Thank
also,
you.
what was your favorite pet? Because I know you had a lot of those.
What's my favorite what?
Pet. The seal, probably, that you mentioned.
The sea lion.
The sea lion.
It was a sea lion.
Sorry, whatever.
It wasn't the coatimundi that bit my mother right here.
Oh,
You're not supposed to laugh when you're bit by a coatimundi.
it just struck me as, very personal and funny.
Sympathy, a little
Well,
sympathy.
I'll give you
with it.
that later. Okay.
So my mother. My mother grew up with 7 brothers and sisters, so that helped. I could tell so many funny stories about my mother. So what helped her a lot, I think you asked me before. First of all, she had a very strong Catholic faith, and she did go to Mass every day, and always carried a rosary with her, and named her 4th child, David Anthony, after St. Anthony, who always found her a parking space in front of Saks, for instance.
I'm trying not to laugh. I'm trying. I know how you feel.
So that was very important. So that's part of it. 2, she didn't really respect authority, so she was very zippy. For instance, and this is a story I'm sure you know, we lived near the CIA, and there was kind of what was supposed to be safe houses there. And once we used to ride there a lot because there was some land. And once we were riding there, and she heard some horses whining, and she looked in and she realized the horses were starving. So she got our groom. Doesn't everybody have a groom?
I'm sorry.
To go and pick up the horses and bring them to our house, which some people consider stealing. And stealing at that time stealing horses was a hanging offense in Virginia at that time. And Daddy was the Attorney General. So you had the situation, which I was in, again, in elementary school, the wife of the Attorney General is stealing horses. And that is an interesting challenge because you both have breaking the law and the law enforcer. So Daddy got her a good attorney.
And what happened?
She got off.
And the horses?
Well, the horses were, she should have gotten off because the horses were starving, and, she should get off for that. But she was zippy. That helped a lot. She would have the cabinet over, and she'd turn off all the lights and put a pig in the house and grease him up and said, whoever wins catches the pig.
That's unusual.
You think?
Yeah.
So that's kind of weird. And then once she was downstairs, that was the coatimundi, and she was showing the press our basement where my brother Bobby was keeping all the pigeons because he was a falconer and he wanted to keep the pigeons, so he'd teach the falcons to go after the pigeons. It's kind of gross. And Bobby also collected animals, so he had a coatimundi, which is a kind of lizard. You can look it up, from South America. And the coatimundi bit Mummy right here. And then she couldn't open the door. You know how doors get locked? So she had to scream and yell, but it was a drag.
Are
Anyway,
you satisfied? Okay. All right, let me get another question. Let me get another question in here. What do we got?
oh, I will tell you one funny story about Mummy. Okay, I got to start with this funny story. So when she was in college, she had a crush on a guy from Ireland who was the best rider from Ireland and really good looking. And so she called him, he was going to do a horse show at Madison Square Garden. So she called him up and she said, I'm from the New York Times, I'd like to interview you. She was at Manhattan College of the Sacred Heart, Catholic school. So she doesn't always tell exactly the truth. Anyway, so she called him up, and they went to a place called Schraff's, which some of you have heard of Schraff's, because it was a really good ice cream parlor in New York City. And she sat down with him, and she started asking questions, and after 10 minutes, he said, "You're not from the New York Times." And he got up, and she thought that was very insulting. So he had this beautiful white stallion that he was showing at Madison Square Garden. So she went in there with a pail of green dye. And she dyed his horse green. He always thought it was the Venezuelans.
We're learning things I could not have imagined, really, all these years. How old is your mother now?
And then he married somebody else. And when and then she read he was back up at Madison Square Garden, so then she was married to my father. So she said to Daddy, "Oh, there's this really nice people up in Madison Square Garden. We should have him down to Georgetown." So she brought him down with his new wife to Georgetown. And they just kept the story of the Venezuelans going.
How old is your mother now?
Don't you think that's enough?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to know. She's still living, and I just wanted to know how old she was.
She's 95.
Wow.
Anyway, she's
great.
very funny. And she's got a great sense of humor. And I'll let it go at that.
Okay, well, good. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you both so much for coming today. I have a question for the both of you. In your opinion, and in the spirit of tonight's event, what does it mean to be actively engaged in democracy?
Well, get involved in a campaign. I mean, seriously, I think I said that to their class. It's so much fun. You know what one of my favorite quotes from John Kennedy is? Well, you're obviously going to hear it. Somebody said, "Why are you running for president?" And his answer was, "Because that's where the action is." And that's where the action is. That's where the fun is. That's where you can get things done if you get involved in politics.
That's a great answer. I would say the same. If you're interested in getting involved in political life, is that how you put it? In what? Democracy. Show up, and you can start just where you are in your own community or your own state. Is there a city councilman? Is there a mayor or a state senator or a U.S. senator campaign coming up? Get involved in those campaigns. You see how the process will go. They may send you out to hand out brochures or organize a speaking bureau or engage people on these questions. And of course, make sure that everybody you know and everybody in your family is registered to vote and goes to the polls. That's a sacred duty to vote whenever that comes up. I've never understood people who say, "Oh, I don't bother to vote." How could you not in this democracy? And then as you get along in your career, consider yourself, whether you might run for office, and why not? Kathleen was Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, and she was great. You have the verbal skills, you have the intellectual skills, you have the study of history and background and the energy and communication skills to do just that. So put that in the back of your mind and think down the road, could I go for that? And when and where might I live that would have a political opportunity for me? Because we need smart, committed, dedicated younger people coming up to help improve our political life and make our government work better.
Yeah.
And as Kathleen says, it's where the action is. You'll meet other interesting people who share your views, and it's a great experience.
So, and I would add two things. Obviously, I agree with everything that you said. The two other things I would say: if you're serious about it, every time you meet somebody, write their name down.
Yes.
and get their phone number.
And have your card. Have your card and your own contact number.
Yeah, but you want to keep up. There was a guy at Harvard who did that. I can't remember what he is, but he was elected for his first race because he knew everybody, and just keep that seriously. And two, you said your own city council, but it's sometimes fun to go to another state, if you're interested in a presidential campaign or senate campaign, because you might want to learn what's going on in Nebraska, for instance. You already know what's going on in Virginia or whatever, or Maryland, whatever state you're from. But it's fun to learn, oh, this is why people in Nebraska feel differently than I do, or this is why people in West Virginia feel differently than I do, or Vermont or something, because different communities do feel differently. And the more you know about the rest of the country, the more it helps you understand where you come from and they come from and why that is.
And a last thought on that, I agree also with what you're saying, but the term civil discourse seems very old-fashioned, but there certainly was a time where you could disagree, but you could have a good conversation. And you certainly didn't threaten anybody, you just engaged the debate and made your points. And I think we need a lot more civil discourse. Certainly it's easy with those with whom we agree, but also with those with whom we disagree. And that's how we move ourselves forward.
Absolutely. Very good.
Yes, well said, well said. Well said.
Okay, next.
With Thanksgiving just around the corner, I was wondering what it must have been like growing up in a household in a family with so many people in politics. Did y'all argue often? And also, I know you have a lot to choose from, but who was your favorite uncle and your favorite aunt?
I think that's a repeat of a question we had from class. But go ahead. Maybe you've changed your mind about which aunt and uncle between.
Didn't I already give you that
You
answer?
did. You did give an answer.
Did
to
you
that.
want me to say the same? Okay.
Well, whose fault is that?
Well,
Okay.
okay. I gave you the answer, which is my aunt, I love, with my godmother, Aunt Jean, who then became the ambassador to Ireland and helped with the Good Friday Accords, which brought peace to Ireland. So that was easy. Then I have uncles, which were a little different. One gave us a sea lion for Christmas, which you don't often get. We kept him for 4 months, and then we gave him to the Washington Zoo. It was really my sea lion because I taught him how to go through the hula hoops into the pool. So that was really special for me. Another uncle was interesting because he hunted whales with a rowboat, which is the way you used to hunt whales. Kind of cool. Another uncle hunted lions, as I told you, and didn't kill them, but would say, George Skakel got me first. So I had
There'd be a sticker.
with a sticker,
Yeah.
with a little
On the lion.
on the lion. So I had a number of different. That was my mother's side of the family. You can see why my mother would paint a horse green, given that's her side of the family. Thank you for asking. And it's interesting to have that side of the family and the Kennedy side of the family, which was extremely serious about life, and the other side of the family.
Really, you don't get that impression, really, that the Kennedys had serious subjects they cared about,
Yes.
but they also knew how to play
yeah.
hard.
Yes,
like
they did.
football.
They played football hard, and captured the flag and all those
Kick the
things.
can, you
Kick
said.
the can.
I love that game.
And kick the can, all sorts of things.
Broke an
Thank
ankle
you.
once.
But thanks for asking. It was, yeah. Anyway,
Good. All right, let's get one or two more questions. We have to cut at 8, but let me get a couple more. What you got? Go ahead.
Hi, Ms. Kennedy. Thank you again so much for coming tonight. I was just wondering, as an official of the Department of Labor, what are your thoughts on the recent wave of union organizing? And do you see the Democratic Party sort of returning to the left labor coalition that elected President Kennedy and that was behind Robert Kennedy?
oh, thank you. I wish I could say yes vigorously. this labor department, you know, under Marty Walsh, who was the first labor secretary and who was a laborer, member of the laborers union, and Joe Biden is very pro-labor, but it is difficult to organize labor unions. And it's helpful that the NLRB is pro-labor. But I have to tell you, I mean, Amazon is, the large corporations do not like labor unions, and they are fighting tooth and nail. Starbucks doesn't want labor unions, Amazon doesn't want labor unions, and Boeing, I gotta tell you, but I mean, can I recommend, can I? Sure. Yes, I can. Yeah. My sister, Rory, is a documentary filmmaker, and she's been nominated a number of times for Oscars. She sits on the Oscar voting. And you remember about Boeing, the flights that went down twice? Mm-hmm. And the people who had Boeing saw that the odds were that 37 more flights would go down. I'm making up that number. It might have been 31. Did you see that?
Yes.
You all saw that movie. Well, Boeing used to be the best airplane, and it was unionized, and people cared about what they were doing, and unions cared about what they were doing. And then they moved from Washington State, Boeing was, to South Carolina, where they knew they wouldn't be organized, and then they started creating really bad airplanes. So it will take much more than 4 years or even 8 years with Joe Biden and the Department of Labor to shift our views about labor unions, because I'm sure you've heard about the Powell memo. You've taught them about the Powell memo?
No. I don't recognize it. What are you talking about?
Okay, I'm going to... So, Lewis Powell from Virginia.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
I knew you did.
Justice Powell, yeah. Well, you didn't say Justice Powell. I know a lot of Powells. But go ahead.
Okay. Do you want me to go ahead?
I want you to go ahead. I really do.
Okay. So Lewis Powell, before he was Justice Powell, I think was head of the Chamber of Commerce in Richmond, Virginia. And he wrote a memo, this is probably in the late 60s, that said, we are losing the ideological battle about unions, about civil rights, about, he might have meant environmental rights, but as you heard from me, that wasn't very strong at that time. We need to galvanize people to intellectually to say we need free enterprise, and which will be anti-union, anti-environmental, anti-civil rights, okay? And he did. And he got corporations to put large amounts of money into Heritage, Cato, AEI, Hoover Institute in Stanford, so that when Ronald Reagan ran for president, he was running not just by himself, but with a whole intellectual behemoth behind him, which helps a lot, because it's really ideas that move history, not just arms. It really is ideas. And the left didn't respond in kind, to put it bluntly. We did not put as much funding into ideas. And as a result, I would say, I mean, you can disagree with, I mean, obviously I don't have to tell you, you've disagreed with me a lot already this evening. Yes, you have, well done. And so for the last 30 years, that ideology has been fairly dominant, and it's very hard to overcome that ideology. And it's a fight now. I mean, you can see what's going on in that House of Representatives, and it's gone even further to the right. And so it's going to take some time to it's going to take some work, not just time. Work, time, language matters. And that is the fight that we're having now about what it means to be, what is just, what does justice mean? What does freedom mean? I mean, if you read Martin Luther King's speeches, it's all about freedom, because freedom means you get to eat where you want to eat, you get to live where you want to live, you get to work where you want to work. And then the left lost the word freedom, and it's gone to the right. So we have to recapture in words, and we have to recapture a whole ideology. I know that's a longer answer than you wanted, but it's the one I wanted to give.
We're over on this side of the room now.
Okay, good. I was wondering what was happening over there.
Thank you very much for being here. I just wanted to lighten the mood a little bit and say a comment rather than ask a question, and to say that, and it might let you off the hook a little bit too, because you were talking about organized crime and all of that, and I just wanted to say that I believe that organized crime is definitely an equal opportunity employer. So there's enough to go around for every nationality in the universe.
You are right. That's so correct.
And then we have one more student question over here.
Hello, my name's Molly. I'm a fourth year at UVA. Thank you both for coming. We've heard so much about your amazing careers, and so I was just curious if you have any advice for young women in politics.
Both of you can answer that one, because there still are a lot of barriers.
Well, I mean, the first thing is do it. I mean, you learn first of all, get involved. 2, practice speaking. I mean, if you're going to run for yourself, I'm serious, practice, and figure out how you're going to practice. Like, I'll tell you what I did after my first run for office. I decided to teach, because that meant that every day I had to get up in front of a class and talk. That didn't mean I knew what I was talking about. It just meant that I had to talk.
That's true for us all.
So anyway, I'm just saying that it's just a good practice. And 3, you really do have to think about what you want to look like, because you're going to be judged all the time on what you look like. And traditionally, I'm going to give you a longer answer about this. Traditionally, Republicans can be sexier than Democrats. And there are 2 kind of exceptions to that rule, I would say. Nancy Pelosi always looks fabulous. And Ocasio, AOC, always looks fabulous. And that's great, because she's also younger. But, and one of the challenges for women, and I've written about this, is that we don't have any archetypes of women in power in the United States. Because we're a democracy, we don't have any queens, as they do in England and most around the world. Somebody said we have a lot of queens in Miami, but that's a different type. And I gotta keep you awake.
No, everybody's awake. There's no question about that.
And the second is because we are a Protestant country, our God is male. And like in Latin America, it's a Catholic country. And so there's Queen Mary everywhere, which helps. So although there's a male God, there's a Queen Mary. And so you have the presidents of Argentina, Chile, and Brazil there have been female presidents. And in India, they have 70 million gods and half are female. So if you look at all our all our holidays, they're mostly all for men. There are no women except for a mother, and she's not. Freud's taught us to blame our mothers for everything. So, and it's not a powerful position that organizes a lot of people. Anyway, so it's a very difficult for Americans to know what a powerful woman looks like. And that's one of our challenges. Although I think Nancy Pelosi has helped enormously on that. But she works at it, and it is expensive to do what she does.
I'd add to that.
That's true.
It is. It's just true.
Yeah. And I say this both to the young men and the young women. Don't be shy. Step up. And as you do that, do what you can to find your voice. I'm a big supporter of taking debate. You need to practice because your voice is what conveys and captures and intrigues others to hear what you're saying. Your voice is very important. You made passing reference to this earlier. I also did what you did. At one point, somebody said to me, Gillian, you should take a few voice lessons so you don't sound so girlish. That was the word he used. And I said, oh, I can't. I'm really not a singer. He said, no, I don't mean singing. I mean speaking. You need to find your lower, fuller voice. It all has to do with breathing from down in your lower diaphragm. And that's not hard to learn. And I did, in fact, take just about 4 sessions with a speech coach who helped me discover that lower voice. And as it happened, as you know, I went into the diplomatic world where your voice matters. Again, not just what you say, but how you say it and how it sounds. And to add to Kathleen's point about how you look, somebody said to me, look around and see the job that you hope to have someday. Look up the ranks, so to speak. How does that person dress? Now, I know styles are a little more informal now, but you have to dress not like you're just hanging out, but like you have the presence and the capacity to do that job. And in my diplomatic world, I found those nice suits and jackets, and that became my uniform. But it was, in fact, the uniform of the job that the women who were up there, not so many of them, but some, that's how they dressed. And I think that works in diplomacy as well as in politics. I agree with you, Nancy Pelosi is incredible, and she always looks great. It does take time and attention and money to dress that way, but there are ways of doing it that aren't quite as expensive, I think. But it is something to keep in mind because it's in politics, people take you make an impression in 5 seconds, and that's how you're put together. So you don't want to be consumed by that, but it is something to consider.
They were great answers. I hadn't even considered some of those things, man, because I'm male and I just pick things up off the floor each
The
morning.
men have
Put them on, pretty much the same thing I wore yesterday.
the men have the easy part. And I do have to go back to the Kennedy administration. There were no women in those upper ranks. That was a different era. But now there are some, and there should be more. And, maybe they're in this room.
They're here, men and women. We're very proud of them. They're going to do a great job. We got the fashion instruction. We've gotten education and government and politics and history. And I think we've covered the waterfront thanks to you too. And I'd like to ask everybody to join me in a warm round of applause for Gillian and Kathleen. Great to be with you.